Hi, Adam. Nice to see you.
You too. Good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us. Where are you joining us from?
I am outside the New York City area. We have been quarantined for 12 weeks, and I
Wow.
think my family has never seen me before so much. So we're enjoying the time together. We have all these evenings like we've never had before, since usually I'm traveling or seeing concerts, and we've been soaking in a lot of movies, catching up on classics, and really enjoying learning new cooking and baking recipes.
That's awesome. It's good to find sort of the shining light, I guess, the positive silver lining in all of this.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So let's go right into it. Can you tell us a little bit about your background, where you were born, how you were introduced to classical music, and then sort of your journey into management?
Sure. I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina. That's where I got my name from.
Oh wow.
Um, and I didn't grow up there, though. I actually grew up in Jersey. And when I was just short of 1 year old, we moved to Jersey, where my father took a position at Rutgers University. So I grew up in East Brunswick, New Jersey. And it was a great place to grow up because, just tying in with the topic that we're going to discuss today, it was not a homogeneous community. Central Jersey tends to be quite diverse. It has Johnson and Johnson and AT&T and T and Lucent Technologies, so it attracts a lot of Asians and immigrants, Indians, Asians, and those are the families that I grew up with. There were a lot of white Catholics, Protestants, Jews. So it was quite a diverse area that I grew up in. And when I was 4 years old, my sister, who was 4 years older than me, my biggest sister, started in the fourth grade. And as is in the system in New Jersey, you start in the string program.
Hmm.
So she started violin, and I just watched her, and I thought that is the coolest thing ever. So being a 4 year old who was very curious, I asked my parents if I could start. So I
Wow.
started around the same time she did, and I just loved it and did the Suzuki method. And later on, I dabbled in piano when I saw both my sisters playing piano. So their model was very influential on me. Then I got really serious in high school, and I did all the competitions and um, all the all state, all regional, all Eastern, all national orchestra. Um, and then I was concertmaster of the New Jersey Youth Symphony, and then we went to Carnegie Hall, and then we played in the all national orchestra, and then I did various competitions. Um, and my parents never really had to force me to practice. I just always enjoyed it. And when I went to college, I ended up choosing the University of Texas at Austin.
Hmm.
I had gotten into several conservatories, but I hadn't decided yet whether I wanted to go into performance or teaching. And honestly, I didn't know that there were careers like what we do now. And in high school, at your job fairs, you either, become a teacher, or you learn about being a policeman or fireman, or
Yeah.
it's pretty standardized, and you don't discover that there are so many different types of nuanced professions out there like what we do. So I chose as diverse and broad a program as I could find. Um, University of Texas at Austin is one of the largest universities, public universities in the States, and they have a lot of funding. And so they basically gave me a full ride to go there, but I
Wow.
had an opportunity to study in both, get bachelor's in both the fine arts school and the liberal arts school. So I majored in violin performance, studying with Vincent Fratelli, who was the former concertmaster of the Hong Kong Philharmonic, and his teacher was Ivan Galamian, who also taught Perlman and so many other greats. And I also majored in a liberal arts honors program called Plan 2, which
Wow.
was an interdisciplinary program that had classes of no more than 25 students. So it was basically like an Ivy League within the context of a large university, where we could study with top professors in small classes on creative writing and philosophy and so on. But in my senior year, the last week of school before graduation, I had no idea what I wanted to do, and I had a law school admission in hand at American University School of Law, and I thought, I don't think I really want to be a lawyer. I just did it because most Plan 2 majors would either go into Rhodes scholarships or go to law school. That's just what we did.
Wow.
And I didn't want to go into performance. I had decided that I knew that I didn't want to spend my life in a practice room. The summer before, I studied with a teacher in Massachusetts, and he said, if you can imagine a life doing something other than this, go for that, because this is too grueling a career to not be absolutely sure you want to sweat all this blood and tears for it. And I said, you know what? I could do something totally different. Doesn't have to be this. I just hadn't stumbled upon the discovery of being able to do music without practicing.
Mm.
So in my last week of school before graduation, I was at a reception with the director of our School of Music at University of Texas. His name is Dr. Ronald Crutcher, and he's now the president of the University of Richmond and continues to be someone very significant in my life. And Dr. Crutcher said, Charlotte, why don't you do an internship program that we've just learned about? It's the Joni Abbott Music Foundation, and it no longer exists, but it was a program that provided opportunities in the music business in New York and Los Angeles. And so I thought, oh, music business, what's that? That sounds interesting. And so I applied. I got a full ride to go to New York, and they set me up in an apartment, paid me a weekly stipend, and they arranged for me to have 2 internships. And because I didn't know if I wanted to go to law school and I was still undecided, they set me up with Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, wow, which is a nonprofit organization that arranges pro bono work for artists in need. And the other internship was Polygram Classics and Jazz, which is now called Universal Music Classics. That's the biggest record conglomerate in the business that oversees the labels of Deutsche Grammophon, London, at the time, Philips, and other labels. And it was an incredible experience. Basically, within the second week of my internship at Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts, I knew I didn't want to spend the rest of my life drafting memos and having no touch point with artists or music. And when I was at the record company on those days, it was so exciting because we were rolling out the first tour support for Andrea Bocelli's U.S. tour. Wow. And it was his first time at Madison Square Garden. He was playing with the Pittsburgh Symphony, and he was promoting his aria and romanza albums. And it was just the coolest thing ever. And I thought, like, if I have to spend all my time on the phone with radio stations, encouraging them to play Andrea Bocelli and Leila Sefowitz and Joshua Bell records, this is a really cool job. Yeah. The only thing cooler in my mind as I went through the internship was if I could have a touch point with artists. So every once in a while, we'd get this call from Italy, and everyone would be running around the office. Andrea Bocelli's manager's on the phone. She's calling from Italy. Pick up the phone, pick up the phone. And so she would call for the record label executive. And I just thought, wow, there's someone behind these artists who's actually strategizing for their careers. And it's not just about record companies. So I learned about this concept of an agent for classical musicians. And this is shortly after Jerry Maguire, the movie that Tom Cruise starred in, came out. And I was like, oh, it's like being Jerry Maguire for classical musicians. Yeah. How cool is that? And so by the end of my internship, Dr. Crutcher, who was mentoring me, said, so, and I said, Dr. Crutcher, I've decided what I want to do. I want to be a classical music agent. I want to keep promoting artists, but instead of promoting CDs, at the time we didn't have MP3s, it was all CDs. I want to do it at the center of artists and the strategy for their careers. And he's like, well, I know just the person I should introduce to you. His name is Charles Hamlin. And Charlie, may he rest in peace, was the founder of IMG Artists and the one who discovered Joshua Bell, Evgeny Kissin, Emerson String Quartet, brought James Galway to America, literally brought Kissin from Russia to America. Wow. And he basically was no longer running IMG. He had passed it on to Edna Landau because he was running Classical Action Performing Arts Against AIDS. And I met with him in his Classical Action office in Times Square. And I said, I want to be an agent. How do I do it? He said, well, there's
You
a
sure?
process.
Yeah.
You can't just jump into being a booking agent or a manager. It'd be good if you start at the bottom. I said, you really think I need to start from the bottom? He said, sure. It'd be good if you could learn the servicing and production and logistical aspect of taking care of artists, how to get them into the country. Because when you are this big time agent, you're the one they're going to call when they're stuck at customs. It'd be good if you know how to
Exactly.
take care of all these things. So basically, Charlie introduced me to Edna Landau, and they happened to have a position open that they were just starting to post in the New York Times. This is back before all the job career apps existed and jobs were advertised in the New York Times. And I went in, and after meeting the whole group and having 3 grueling interviews, I got the job. And that was 17 years of my tenure at IMG, where I basically started as an associate taking care of artists such as Joshua Bell, Evgeny Kissin, Hilary Hahn. And at the time, we had just signed Lang Lang, who was a completely unknown name. He was a 16-year-old boy from China. And basically, I ended up working my way up from servicing to booking to management, and then taking over several artists, signing several artists, including Nicola Benedetti,
Mm-hmm.
who I signed 15 years ago for North American management. And so that was basically what brought me to 2015, 17 years later. And you know the rest of that story, since we were colleagues at IMG.
Yeah.
And I decided to go out on my own and start Primo Artists, and take several artists with me, including Itzhak Perlman, Nicola Benedetti, and our conductor, Cristian Măcelaru. And since then, it's been 5.5 years. It's been an incredible ride. And like you, I just really enjoy the nimbleness and the autonomy of running my own agency and working for artists who I want to work for, and just being able to do it in my own way. We manage 10 artists, so our roster has expanded since we started in 2015. We have 3 violinists, Itzhak Perlman, Joshua Bell, Nicola Benedetti. We have 2 pianists, Sungjin Cho, Beatrice Rana. We have 4 conductors, Cristian Măcelaru, our original conductor, Christian Reif, Gemma New, and we recently took on James Gaffigan. And we have 1 composer, Wynton Marsalis. That was quite a surprise. I never really thought I would go into composing representation, but it was born out of a 7-year collaboration that was unofficial, where Wynton and I, through the introduction of Nicola Benedetti and the concerto that he wrote for her, worked together. And so we just only recently made it official last year. So
Wow.
that brings us up to modern day.
Now, yeah, that's, tying that all in, it's a fantastic journey. And I think, just as a little aside, I love to talk about people's backgrounds, because nobody really talks about how to get into management or what the path was, because the path is different for everybody. So everybody listening,
Yes.
if you have an interest, don't think that you have to go and do a certain path. It's find your path, use your network. um, your roster is inherently diverse, right? I think it's a good mix of different cultures and people. Was that an intentional decision that you made, or was that something that just sort of happened?
I don't think it was intentional. I didn't set out to have a diverse roster, but I think that's also just my view on life. When you invited me to join in this conversation about diversity, I thought, well, I am Asian American, but I've never really thought of myself as a minority. I don't think being Asian constitutes being a person of color. I think being a person of color is being Black or Latino. But I have heard over the years the reference of being a minority, but I don't think of myself in that way. And when you invited me, I thought, what do I have to contribute to this conversation? Because I can't say definitively or consciously that I have ever encountered discrimination being an Asian. And I think that some other people might view some experiences of mine in a way that could be discrimination, but I just was never raised that way. And I think that being raised by your family basically is formative to everything you do, to how you work, how you think, how your view is on life, how you interact with people in your relationships and in a professional environment. So I didn't grow up in an environment where my parents would say, we're being profiled because we're Asian. They stopped us because we're Asian. They didn't let us buy those things because we're Asian. My parents aren't that type of people to view it that way or to articulate it. And if it happened, they didn't say anything. So I didn't grow up with that mentality. And I'm so grateful for that because I had this purist view that I could accomplish anything. And there were impediments that were in my way, but it had nothing to do with the color of my skin. It just had to do with time, experience, opportunity, and carving out the opportunity to make it real. So I think that's something to to think of going forward as we talk about diversity. It's easy to have this victim kind of perspective, like, oh, well, I didn't get it because, I'm not white. But if you're not wired that way because you haven't been raised that way, or you've changed your mentality after being raised a certain way, it can really change your view. I just think about one of our artists, Wynton Marsalis, who in this whole movement post George Floyd and the incident that happened, when he posted his long letter on Facebook on Sunday, it was really poignant because he admitted that being born in 1961, right in the middle of the civil rights movement, and being born the son of parents who grew to adulthood in the civil rights movement, they were so used to being profiled, stereotyped, and discriminated against that he grew up thinking, I am a minority. And a minority is the diminutive. And when you think of yourself in that way, then you're already putting yourself in a negative position. And I think that has taken probably a lifetime for Wynton to get his head around that. Like, why was he thinking that it would be anything less than whole to grow up that way? He didn't know anything different. So I think that how one grows up or raises people really can have an impact. I'm a mother of two children, and I and my husband are of the view that we don't talk about things that way. When Hillary Clinton ran for president, we didn't say she could be the first ever female president. Isn't that so awesome? It was just Hillary Clinton is running for president. We don't talk about people with their genders or color. And so my daughter never even thought for a second that that was strange. It was like, oh yeah, Hillary for president. So if you have a view that it's not strange, or you don't call a conductor female because she's a female conductor and it's not standardized, she's a conductor. The same thing with Itzhak Perlman. Growing up with polio in the 40s, getting polio 1 year before Jonas Salk had invented the vaccine. It was poor timing for Itzhak Perlman, but he knew nothing else. However, when he won the Leventritt competition in 1964, people had said in the industry, he's never going to make it. He's in a wheelchair. How's he going to have a concert career? He can't even walk around. How is he going to get on an airplane? But being born into a family where his parents never even pointed out that he would have limitations just gave him a mentality that there was nothing he would be impeded by. And it was only a matter of time before people would stop referring to him in concert reviews as the man in the chair, as the man on crutches, as the violinist who has polio. And now it took 10, 15, 20 years. By the early 70s, he was the violin virtuoso. But it took a while for people to get over the reference of the man who plays from the wheelchair.
Yeah. And
so
I
it's
think
all mentality.
that's really interesting because that's kind of the moment that we're in right now with the Black rights movement, right? I think is that it's taken, well, you could argue 100 years, 300 years, to get this far. But so then how do you how do you balance then the sort of what am I trying to say? How do you balance the mentality of, okay, I'm gonna just keep pushing and keep going on, right? With the real reality that there are advantages that are given to certain groups of people in the music industry, right? Because of things that they haven't done, that because of their skin color, because of their sexual orientation, because of whatever it might be, because they're a man or a woman. How do you sort of balance that
Mm.
with?
Yes, you're right in pointing out that there are clearly impediments, and that can't be ignored.
Yeah.
But I just think that it's about your goals and how driven you are. Um, I think the people who accomplish things as people of color or people who have impediments, like Itzhak Perlman did with polio, don't have time for that.
Hmm.
They don't have time to reflect on those things, and they just plow ahead. Um, I'm just thinking about Wynton 33 years ago when Jazz Lincoln Center did not exist. Jazz was barely even a genre that was presented by Lincoln Center. Um, so when he first had his first performance in the jazz capacity, not classical, at Lincoln Center, he was invited back, and there were letters written from white people to the Lincoln Center saying, "What is a black man playing music that's not classy enough for our institution?" But Lincoln Center was supportive, obviously, of Wynton, seeing the talent that he had, and felt that it was their mission to expand on the genre of music that they presented. So they brought him back. And then they brought him back 3 times a season. And then they brought him back 4. And then it became its own series. And then it basically, 33 years ago, was incorporated as its own institution that was separate from Lincoln Center. And now it's got its own building and over a $50 million annual budget. So, yes, it was difficult when Wynton first started out, and there was a lot of hate mail. But he didn't let it impede him. He just kept on plowing forward, and look what they're doing now. So
Yeah.
that's how
So
we make progress.
there's a comment from Devere Burnett, but they shouldn't have to. I think that's referring to not having people shouldn't have to overcome these obstacles and have to try to put their blinders on and focus on the work and ignore the outside noise. I think what you're saying, right, is that the classical music industry can do its part by focusing on diversity and inclusion, like Lincoln Center did with Wynton, and support the artists in spite of the hate mail that they're getting, or whatever sort of social dissonance is happening outside. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. I think it's like the same question as if you believe in a divine being, why does God allow suffering? Why is he allowing this pandemic? Sure, we can ponder that. We will not have the answer. In my view, it's pretty much pointless to think about that because it is what it is, and we just need to be pragmatic and deal with it and find a way to thrive in this environment instead of asking questions that are rhetorical. I'm all about pondering the deep questions of life and the meaning of it. But I'm not sure that's a question that is really productive to dwell on because we have too much work to do, and we just have to get on with it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way, and I appreciate you sharing it. I think that's a really interesting way to go about it. Just you've got to focus on your work. You've got to get down, and you've got to make the progress. And find the people that support you in the way. Yeah, this is exactly right. Devere Burnett also comments, just like you fight a pandemic, you should fight racial injustice. It's the same sort of thing. So then, to that end, do you think that the classical music community has done an adequate job with that kind of support, and as a social entity, has it done an adequate job in inviting a diverse enough group of people into the concert hall, into the opera house, and has it done a good enough job at making that atmosphere inside the concert house and opera house welcoming for everyone? You know, I think we talked about this yesterday, right? A little bit.
I think it's an excellent question. I think if you were to have asked it 2.5 years ago, I would say the classical music industry has done very little. It's not a priority to look at diversity as a mission, and it's so far off from where it needs to be. Less than 1% of the works performed by any orchestra in the United States was by a person of color. And if you don't represent reality, then you're not reflecting something that's accurate. So diversity is reality, and it needs to reflect what the actual makeup of our society is. The problem, though, I think, was brought to light with Harvey Weinstein 2.5 years ago and the whole Me Too movement. And it was revelatory in that people could have a voice, women, and diversity for the first time ever in our industry became a priority. And so now it's not 1% or less that people of color's works are performed by orchestras, and the number of people of color in the audiences and in orchestras and just in general in the performing arts industry and gender has catapulted exponentially over the last 2.5 years, thanks to the Me Too movement. Now more than ever, everybody wants a female conductor. It's like the hottest thing in the industry. And if you're a male white conductor, that's pretty unfortunate. Trying to have a career now, getting your foot in the door is difficult. And I think you can say on the flip side, affirmative action has taken priority so much so that there's a contingent of artists that are getting opportunities that don't deserve it from a perspective of their talent. It could be argued that they're getting the gig because they're a female conductor. And that goes into dangerous territory, but it is something that is upsetting to a lot of segments of our industry right now. And I think one needs to find the balance. And that's how I look at my roster. I don't sit there and say, oh, Primo needs to have something that looks more diverse because that is my mission. I look at other people's rosters and I think, wow, that is a really white male dominated roster. That's just not a reflection of the reality out there. But on the flip side, I don't think, oh, I need a female conductor on my roster. I need a female violinist on my roster. I don't think of it that way. But I do think when I looked at Christian Reif, our German conductor, I thought when I saw him conduct, he reminded me so much of our Romanian conductor, Cristian Măcelaru, not just because they have the same name, not because they're both European and they were both in their 30s, but they almost evoked each other in a way of subdued music making and gestures to communicate their musicianship. And I thought, I'm not sure at this point in the development of our roster, because we didn't have a second conductor, that I can take someone who's also in his 30s, white male conductor. But the more I thought about it and looked at other conductors, I just kept on going back to Christian because I thought he's so great. And the funny thing is, when I showed it to Cristian Măcelaru, he said, he reminds me of me. It's like, I haven't seen a young talent out there in a long time who's really, really special. And he reminds me, and I thought, you know what? It's not homogeneous. It's just the commonality is talent. They both happen to be white males in their 30s. And I thought, you know what? His talent justifies him being on a roster, even if he is also white male and in his 30s. But then when I was seeing this movement, this trend towards signing female conductors, and I had male conductors, I didn't set out to sign a female conductor because it was the thing to do. And I would just take any which conductor. And right. I do actually think some of the agencies out there are signing conductors who they wouldn't have signed because the talent isn't at a certain level, but they are signing them because they're female. But when Gemma New and I decided to work together, it was her talent that drove my decision to sign her. Um, and it was appealing to me, yes, that she's female, but it's always about talent, and then second about how they fit in with our roster. So I am conscious of it, but I do not let the diversity aspect lead the reason why I sign someone. It's a secondary aspect that I'm very aware of.
Yeah, I mean, I think talent also always has to come first in the music industry, right? If it doesn't matter how diverse the cast is on stage, if the talent isn't there, then the audience will not be moved, the audience will not be connected, and it could, ultimately backfire, and drive people away from the art form, right? Um, what do you think? That's incredible. Yeah, folks, I know that we're getting a lot of comments, and then I saw some folks joined. Lauren Decker, Anthony Clark Evans, Ryan Speedo Green, I think, was on to leave us your questions. If you have some topics that you think are important, or if there's something that you want to add to the conversation, leave the questions in the comments. And if there's something that you like, hit the little love button, because we love to hear feedback. We want this to be as sort of interactive as possible.
You were asking about the question of what institutions can do to bring us forward in this movement towards diversity. I think it's an excellent question. So just going on the residual effects of the Me Too movement, it's a great thing that orchestras and presenters all around the world are very conscious in making that part of their mission, admitting that in the past diversity was not even a thought that crossed their mind. And while some have gone to the opposite end and made complete exclusive female seasons, which I think is humorous and well intended, but also not a reflection of reality. I think that there still is progress to be made, because it's not just about programming. It's not about programming a piece of music by a Black female composer. It goes so much deeper than programming. It it can extend into education, which gets to the very core of our future audience. So Deborah Borda, the CEO of the New York Philharmonic, had invited our conductor Gemma New to the first rebranded series of the Young People's Concerts post Theodore Wiprud, who used to lead the YPCs. This is the famous series that Leonard Bernstein led as music director of the New York Philharmonic that was broadcast on CBS all those years. So it's an important series, and it is the first touch point that many 6 to 9-year-olds see concerts. I bring my kids to these concerts. And Deborah felt it was very important for the conductor of this first YPC to be female. She wasn't going to just hire any female. Of course, Deborah's always driven by the priority of top talent, as we were discussing. So she invited Gemma, and my kids were in the audience, and we had 3,000 people in the audience, 2 concerts each, and it was incredible to see a female conductor up there, because it was the first touch point for these kids. My daughter sees a female conductor up there, and it's not anything that's out of the ordinary. It's natural. And that's, I think, an important philosophy to carry with us. We need to think about role models and setting up a paradigm for people, not just young people, but everyone to follow. I said in the beginning of this conversation, I don't feel like I've been discriminated against as an Asian or in this industry as a woman. Or as a young person, because there are so many role models before me who paved the path. I happen to be on a side of the industry that is very, very welcoming to females. Artist managers, by default, need to be caring people who look after human beings. And so that kind of caretaking empathy obviously is natural in women. And so for 70 years, it's been something where it's been natural for our industry to have women in it. And I can't say the same for Deborah Borda, who was the first ever appointed female of a major orchestra when she first went to the New York Philharmonic as executive director in 1991. There was no one before her. She was it. It was a male-dominated field to be CEO of a major American arts institution. But for me, I think about my predecessors. Annie Friedberg, the manager of Horowitz in the 1940s, also a peer of hers, Ann Colbert, who started Colbert Artists, which is
Hmm.
over 70 years old now in its fourth generation, led now by one of my friends, Lee Prince, who's my age in his mid 40s, who's a gay man. And so how could a gay man or someone like me, a female Asian American person in her 40s, lead artist management agency? It's because we have people who have paved the path for us. Thea DeSpecker also was a contemporary of Ann Colbert and Annie Friedberg, and she started DeSpecker Artists, which is still going strong in its 70th year. So we have much to be grateful for. And Deborah Borda is the one paving the path for the female CEOs of orchestras today, because now when you look at the top 15 orchestras in North America, New York Phil, Atlanta Symphony, Detroit Symphony, LA Phil, St. Louis Symphony, Kennedy Center, which oversees National Symphony Orchestra, Dallas Symphony, right there is 7 female run institutions of the 15. That's a 43%. So going from 0% 30 years ago to 42%, we're not doing so badly. But then I think about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and when she is always asked, how many female Supreme Justices need to be in the Supreme Justice for you to be happy, for you to be content? She says 9, when all 9 are female. So we can't stop at 42%, and we always have to keep talent at the forefront of who we place in these positions of authority. But we are making progress, and when we think about it from programmatic perspective, education perspective, who we put in leadership positions, how we put musicians on stage. The introduction in the 1950s of the Boston Symphony with blind screening process for their musicians to audition was revolutionary. And that's why Boston is one of the orchestras that has the most diverse components gender-wise. And then when the other orchestras picked up on it in the 60s and 70s, and then they started introducing beyond the screen carpet so that people couldn't hear clicking of heels when they walk up to their stand for the audition. That was huge. So now that parity is there, and we just have to work on audiences. So making people feel comfortable, as you suggest, because some settings, whether it's an opera house or something that is new to someone who's never been there, it has to be as inclusive as possible, where people don't sneer at others for clapping in between movements. And so we're working on breaking down those barriers, talking from the stage, saying it's okay to clap, not criticizing people or slapping them on the wrist if they do something improper.
Right.
So the good thing is that we are on the path to progress. We're not there yet, but we are so much further ahead than where we used to be decades ago.
You had talked about this idea when we were having the discussion about this talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and then adding the B, which stands for belonging, right? Because that's
Yes.
totally different, feeling a sense of belonging, than just feeling inclusion.
Yes. So the hot topic and the acronym has been for the last few years DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the B has been added, and not everyone has caught on. But if you're paying attention, let's make it a standardized hashtag. So DEIB. So you can be inclusive and you can focus on diversity and equity. But if you don't help people feel like they belong, they're going to leave. And education is part of that. Classical music is hard to understand for Joe Schmo because it requires some kind of understanding. You can't just go into it sometimes without any kind of background. And there are some programs that can be appreciated, but then there are others. If you're sitting at the Met and no one has taught you to press that button in front of you, how are you going to understand if you
Yeah.
don't know that there are subtitles right in front of your face and you're watching, unless it's Porgy and Bess or some Britain opera that's in English, you're not going to know and you're not going to feel like you belong or that you're included. So we have to break down these barriers and help our neighbors feel like they belong. Otherwise, they're not going to come back to the concert hall or the opera house.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point, and I think that goes to the atmosphere inside the opera house or the concert hall, and making that feel welcoming and like you said, belonging. There is a question in the comments that I think is interesting from Devere Burnett again. Talent level seems to only be a question when talking about diverse artists. What about the normalized white mediocrity on the opera stage and on the concert stage that's welcome with open arms? I think there is a good deal of mediocre musicians and artists on stage, right? What do you think about that?
I think that it's hard to pin it down to being the color of their skin. There's a lot of talent out there that's featured, and people have chosen to put them in various positions for different reasons. If someone could have played better, it could be subjective, but if they truly play better and they're not in that position, it may be because of various reasons. Programming can be done through factors of who other people are programming. People like to pay attention to what other institutions are bringing. And if they find that they keep seeing 6, 7, 8, 9 times this name over and over and over, they are curious because obviously someone's catching on to something and there's a reason for it. And maybe the technique isn't there, but maybe there's this pizzazz in the way that they connect with audiences. Or maybe they have an incredibly robust social media following and these artists are selling tickets. Or maybe they just won a competition. A competition is a great way of getting into the spotlight if you didn't have a name that was known. And a lot of people argue about who deserves first prize in various competitions. And they'll say, well, the Leeds winner certainly was not as good as the second prize winner of the Leeds. And why is he getting these gigs? But it could be the flavor of the month. And the industry can be brutal in that way that it can really give a lot of opportunities all at once. And for 24 months, you are that flavor. And within 5 years, if you haven't proven yourself worthy of that initial opportunity, and debuts do come easily, the hard part is the re-engagement. And if
Mm,
you can't garner a re-engagement, well, so it was a nice short-lived 3-year career. So I wouldn't dwell on it too much because they might have gotten that opportunity because of something that's controversial, but they will not come back time and time again, proving themselves after every performance. If they're not solid, if they don't have something to say, if they don't have a platform and an articulate way of speaking out, a persona that people are really attracted to, a fan base that will draw the tickets in. So there's so many different factors.
yeah, I think that's really important, and it happens in popular culture as well, right? You have artists who are not so talented, right? That get the sort of 15 minutes of fame and then it,
Right.
it goes away. Yeah. Can we just talk? I guess this might be the last topic, depending on how much time we spend on it. But can in the class on Monday with Roberto Calb and Ryan Speedo Green, they talked a lot about community outreach, and it was a call to action for opera companies and orchestras to do more to get people when they're young and introduce the art form to people when they're young. They also talked about this idea that auditions are not accessible to everybody, right? Like you were talking about the blind audition with Boston Orchestra, but even going beyond that, there are barriers to auditions. I think that we don't really think about on a daily basis. Getting to the audition, if it's in a different city, the amount of money that costs, and staying over that night, preparing their repertoire to get to the
Mm.
audition, all these sort of boundaries. Do you find that or how do you, what do you think about that, I guess, is just the question.
I think that there are obstacles. That's not to be denied, but over the decades, I feel that some of those obstacles have been overcome with the programs that are out there. Um, Back in the 60s and 70s, I think that it was very difficult to get into classical music if you didn't have money or education. And the number of scholarship programs out there were not as plentiful as they are now. But because it is something that is becoming more of a priority, I think that the opportunities now provide people with the opportunity to take part in something that they might not have in previous decades. I was just thinking about our violinist Nicola Benedetti from Scotland, who dedicates herself immensely to music education and has gotten the Queen's Medal of Arts from Her Royal Highness Queen Elizabeth. And she started about 15 years ago in this quest for advocacy and music education for the underprivileged. It was a very deep-seated desire of hers because she saw so much how people in societies of wealth and opportunity had privileges, and so she joined very early on as a big sister board member of El Sistema Scotland. And El Sistema, as many of you know, which came out of Venezuela, is a social movement, not a music education movement. And Maestro Abreu started it to fight gang and the prevalence of murder, because Caracas is the #2 murder capital in the world. And so if you weren't being educated in Sistema, you were being pulled in to go to a barrio where people would get killed because they were in gangs. So basically, they replicated this program in Scotland, and now it's replicated everywhere. But Scotland was one of the first countries to take it on, and Nikki was a board member, and so they would spend so much time fundraising to get the funds to lend instruments to people in underprivileged communities. And these kids would be taught every day by volunteer teachers as part of El Sistema. And it would keep them off the streets and from shoplifting or doing whatever loitering that they would have been inclined to do. And she has built that into the Benedetti Foundation, which started 6 months ago. And just on Sunday, we finished an epic 3-week mass tutorial where she and the foundation gifted a 15,000 pound program to the world. In this pandemic, they felt the most useful thing to do was to gift it to the world, where anyone from any society or economic background, whether they were a musician or they only could hit a pot and a pan and couldn't read music, could have the opportunity. We had 7,159 kids from 66 countries in the world, 41 states in America sign up. Some of these kids had never learned how to read music, didn't have parents who had encouraged them in music, and all they needed was internet access, a pot, a pan, and to know how to go onto Zoom. So we had 300 videos and Zoom sessions over 3 weeks. And so there are programs out there that are free. If you dig for it, you can find it, and they will help to fund your way to learning the craft. Our conductor, James Gaffigan, grew up in Staten Island, and his parents were blue-collar workers, and they didn't have money for him to learn his craft. He stumbled upon the bassoon in his 5th grade music class and then ran with that. And basically, his parents happened to bump into a bassoon player from a Broadway theater production who lived across town in Staten Island, and he gifted James with weekly lessons, taught him how to make double reeds, taught him how to play the bassoon at a certain level, and then James applied to every single program out there, and he got scholarships to go into Juilliard pre-college. He got a scholarship to go to New England Conservatory for university. Then he got a scholarship to go to Rice University to get his master's in conducting, and everything James is. Oh, and of course he got into LaGuardia High School was what
Yeah.
catapulted him into Juilliard. So everything he's done has been on the grace of scholarship from people who feel really strongly that those who don't have the funds should be able to pursue those same opportunities as others. So it's out there, and we just have to hunt for it.
Yeah, I think that's really apt, really important to say, to have that conversation. The last thing I think that we should talk about is this question from Devere Burnett, who's been coming through with fire questions. Really fantastic. I'm not sure that we can answer this right now, but I want to have this conversation because I hear you and I understand. And Julie Jackson also sort of supports this question. Not sort of, she supports it. Why is the opera industry so resistant to putting Black people in positions of power? Directors, administrators, managers, casting conductors, etc. I know that you sort of made the point that we've come from in the last 30 years to 42% of women in positions of power at orchestras. On the opera side of things, in administration, you're exactly right. There are very few people of color in positions of power, and even fewer Black people in positions of power, because they're two different things, right? Um, I think as tough, and I don't want to go off too far because this is Charlotte. I really want to hear Charlotte's opinion on this, and this is um, her class, but I really do feel strongly about this. As far as the Met needs to go, as much as they need to work on diversity, and especially with the incident with the noose that was abhorrent and ridiculous, right? I think that they are acknowledging that, and I think that you're seeing with Yannick as a gay man, and this is, I understand that these are not Black people, right? And I think that we do need Black people in administration. But with Yannick as a gay man, as the music director, with Michael Heaston coming in, who has a mother who was born in Puerto Rico, right? With Mark Williams in Cleveland, right? I think is a Black person who is in a big position of power there. I think we're moving in that direction. There's no doubt that we have to move further, and we have to get those points of view and Black people in those positions. And Bill points out board members. Board members are, yeah, absolutely. We have to get Black people on the boards because the boards direct
Yes.
orchestras, opera houses, all of these sorts of things. Etude arts organizations must have better representation at the executive leaderships and board members. Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely. I can't speak so much for the opera world because that's your expertise, Adam. But I did enjoy opening night in the fall of 2019 and seeing Porgy Best get top billing. And that was quite revolutionary, I think, to put this new production of an all-Black cast on opening night. The Met really wanted to make it opening night and not just part of the season. So I thought that was quite remarkable, but admittedly, they have so much more to go.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
going,
I don't want to
mhm,
interrupt you, but I really look forward to the day where it's not just Porgy and Bess that they'll put on. That Porgy and Bess is
yes.
just another part of the canon. That there's going to be 100 Black operas by Black composers and composers of color.
To Etude Art's point, board membership absolutely is a great point. And the Boston Symphony, being the leader they are in diversity, they have a position dedicated to diversifying their board. It's a full-time job, and the person is someone that I know, and she is tasked with finding young and diverse members of the board. That's what she does all the time, hunting for that. So when it is made a priority, it will happen, and it will become that because mission begets action, action begets results.
Yeah,
So, applauding Boston for having that vision, but we need it everywhere else. We certainly
absolutely.
need it in the opera world and more in the orchestra world for sure.
Yeah, San Francisco Opera I know has just created a position of diversity and inclusion for full time, and that person's job is to, make sure that people feel welcome and sense of belonging when they come to the opera house, both as audience members and as artists. Because I think it's a totally relevant to say that some people of color may not feel welcome as an artist walking into the opera house backstage, right? And to orchestral houses.
I just wanted to mention, similar to San Francisco Opera, Detroit Symphony has had for several years someone who works exclusively in diversity and inclusion and belonging, and they are at the forefront of their peers in this issue, and they're the one that everyone consults. They
Wow.
were the first major orchestra to appoint a black man to a post on the podium. Thomas Wilkins had a post there for a very long time, and it just changed the makeup of who would come. When you see a black man on the podium, more black people are just inevitably going to come
Yeah.
to the audience to check it out. So they're very forward thinking in Detroit. They were also the first orchestra to roll out the DSO.org live. And like their counterparts on the other side of the pond, Berlin Philharmonic, Detroit are constantly putting out live casts of their performances, and they've worked out this amazing agreement with their musicians where the musicians just agree to let everything that they perform be used online for no further fees. That's not something that's typically part of a union agreement with
Yeah.
musicians.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think also to add one more thing to the mix, I think the call to action here really, because I'm all about solving problems and getting actual practical steps, right? Is to everybody listening, to everybody that's wants to see more people of color on boards and administration and black people in leadership roles. I think it's up to each of us when we see that type of leadership in somebody that we want to see in those positions to support them and to encourage them and to make them feel like they can get there with our support, and to work your networks and to really do everything that you can to make it possible for them to get where you think that they could go. It's not that all of a sudden the Met is going to pull down, come down, or New York Phil or wherever is going to pull down and pick up somebody just randomly and say, okay, now you can be in a position of power, right? It's going to take all of us sort of demanding that, and to say, hey, you're really talented at this. You're really good at organization. You're really good at interpersonal skills. I see you in administration. Let's if you see that for yourself, let's go. And if enough of us do that for each other, I really feel like the leadership has to listen, that things have to change.
Here, here. I agree with all of it. I think
Good.
it just needs a seed to start, and we have seen progress. As an Asian, I can say that in the 1950s, you didn't see any. You didn't see any Asians, period. You didn't see them in orchestras, and you certainly did not see them on stage. And it wasn't until Seiji Ozawa entered the Besançon competition, and he won that in 1959, and that's where Charles Monch, music director of the Boston Symphony at the time, discovered him and said, you need to leave Japan, come to Boston, come to Tanglewood, our summer home. And that's where Bernstein learned about him. So then Bernstein said, you need to come to New York. And then Herbert von Karajan discovered Ozawa at that same time, invited him to come to Berlin. So it was the first time that an Asian talent was making a significant move from the East to the West to study in Europe. So Ozawa ended up being the only person who ever studied with both Karajan and Bernstein, which is extraordinary. And then he moved to New York. In 1961, after he finished his studies with Karajan in Berlin, he became the assistant to Lenny. at the New York Philharmonic. And then one thing led to another, and all of a sudden he was the first Asian man to make his debut on the podium of the San Francisco Symphony in 1962. And then in 1973, he ended up being invited to become music director of, guess which organization? The Boston Symphony, the very orchestra of which the music director Charles Monch had discovered him at the Besançon competition and invited him to the West. So one thing leads to another. Same thing with Kyung-Wha Chung, who was born in Seoul, and she came to do the Levin-Trick competition 3 years after Perlman won it. She won it. She tied with Pinchas Zuckerman. It was a big deal to have two first prize winners, one of whom was a female Asian. No one had ever seen a female violinist before. An Asian violinist before. And people had barely seen females because Erika Marini, Ida Hendel, Miriam Fried were the only three female violinists in the 60s. There just weren't that many. That was when Oistrakh and Milstein and all the big boys were dominating the scene. But to have Kyung-Wha Chung come as the first Asian was a big deal. And she came in with these strapless dresses, and she was just so glamorous, and everyone was so overwhelmed by her talent, her looks, everything. She got all the gigs. Then 1970, she stepped in for Perlman in that famous concert in London, and then that led to her debuts with Previn and Dutoit, and the list goes on from there. But Kyung-Wha was an idol for me growing up, so I never knew that it was a thing to be extraordinary as an Asian woman. For me, that was natural, right? So she paved the way for all the Asian instrumentalists, and now we have so many. It's hard to differentiate them. That's a subject for another discussion.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, there's so much to talk about with this. And I think, like I said at the beginning of the class, the point of these is not to solve the world's problems, and it's not necessarily going to incite change, although I would love for it to. It's to have the conversation. It's simply having the conversation. It's simply saying these words out loud. We need Black administrators. We need people of color in positions of power in this business, right? That's so important. It's just powerful to say it out loud. And I appreciate that you are here saying it and that you are here sharing your experience. And it is your experience, right? You do not, nobody expects you to represent the entire Asian community, right? This is Charlotte Lee's take on the classical music industry. And I can't wait for the day when we don't have to have diversity and inclusion weeks anymore, because it's just normal to have that. I think it's normal for both of us to operate in that sphere of everything is sort of diversity and inclusion, and we want everybody to be involved, and we do our best. But it's important to highlight it at this point in time, right? Because it's not highlighted enough, unfortunately.
Yes, having the conversation is the first step, and kudos to you for having the foresight to talk about such an important issue. And we have to just keep that dialogue going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Everyone, please leave Charlotte some love in the comments. She did a fantastic job discussing a really tough topic, I think. Everybody wants to say the right things. Everybody wants to be supportive. So it's a hard place to put yourself out there in. I appreciate Charlotte. Everybody appreciates you coming on and having this conversation, talking about it. I look forward to continuing this discussion. Tomorrow we have Latonya Moore, soprano extraordinaire. If you haven't seen the La Mama Morta that we put up on the Promethean page, it's on Instagram, it's fantastic. You have to go look at it. She's going to be talking about her experiences in the operatic side. What is today? Thursday. And then Friday is going to be Francesca Zambello, who is a legend when it comes to diversity and inclusion in opera, and a very, very powerful person, a very, very powerful voice in the industry. And then later on Friday is David Lomelli, who we both know from the Dallas Opera. He has a ton to say about this, and he's going to be even more revved up because we had to delay that from yesterday to Friday. So I hope that you all tune in. Please help get the word out by sharing. Go over to Primo artists and like them, and give them some love too for having this conversation. And send us your questions, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, Charlotte.
Thanks,
I really appreciate
Adam.
it.
Take care. Nice to chat. Bye.
You too.